A growing number of people, Americans especially, are victims of and affected by gun violence. There are nearly two mass shootings a day in the United States. We're recording this just a week after the Kansas City Super Bowl parade shooting. If you are a young adult whom this podcast is for, you no doubt remember or are living through regular live shooter trainings at school, bomb threats, gun threats, walking out of school to stand in the cold for an hour or more while authorities secure the school. You no doubt remember or are living through watching and hearing news of other school shootings and might have asked yourself if you'd be next. If you are a young adult, you truly have had an experience of gun violence and gun ownership that older generations have not. How do we feel about it? What do we do about it? Well, welcome back to Unfolding Wings, that podcast made by young adults for young adults to explore critical life issues and give voice to our wonderings and our questionings and continue to inspire one another to live as faithfully as we can in the way that we feel called to. Now, today, obviously, we're talking about gun violence, gun rights, gun ownership. I'll say this again later, but for this episode especially, we should remind you that we do not represent the views of our church or of young adults generally. The point is that we give space to explore. Now, I keep saying we because I am committed to having co hosts on this show, but it is just me again for this episode because my co hosts are still working through some things. We should be back together for next episode or have some other solution for the next episode. Now, since gun violence and gun rights and gun ownership is a risky topic, we definitely need a safe, quiet place to explore the many possible thoughts and opinions and make our voice known. I'm sure you've experienced this, that whereas many of the other subjects that we've covered already on this podcast and will cover, they might have required some amount of courage to speak on those subjects. At least with most of the other subjects, we could reasonably expect that those who disagree with us would at least respectfully listen and say, "Oh, that's what you think, huh? Interesting." But with gun rights, we can perhaps label the intensity of emotions on the subject as outrageous. Ordinarily calm people might suddenly erupt if you propose an opposing opinion on gun rights. Recently, I preached on peace and asked the question if we Christians have prioritized a civil religion with the Second Amendment more than the actual religion of the Prince of Peace. I didn't say much more than that, so as far as I'm concerned, a legitimate question, one we must ask, especially when we are far more ready to give up on our church than we are to give up our guns. Yet I was accused of using a bully pulpit for simply mentioning a subject that we're apparently not supposed to talk about in church. Again, you've probably had similar experiences. If you've tried having a conversation on gun rights, if you've tried asking a question why people feel certain ways, on whichever end of the spectrum you find yourself on. And if you have, then that's exactly the problem that we're trying to address with this podcast generally. And so I'll remind us again as well that the purpose of this podcast is to provide a digital safe space to say what's on your mind, or to let us say what's on your mind for you, so that we can wonder aloud without being attacked, and then find a way to faithfully move forward. Now, in that same conversation that I referenced, I was reminded that there are former members of the church that no longer attending because they view me as too progressive. What often goes unrecognized, though, is that we have tried pointing out in this podcast episode after episode is that there are plenty of people who are no longer attending the church for the opposite reason as well. We forget that part of it because we always think that we and the people on our side are being victimized and oppressed. The truth is that the church and society as a whole has failed at making people feel that their opinions are welcome, whichever side of the spectrum that we're on, but perhaps especially the side that is advocating and pushing for change. And so, especially today, we will do our best to address the complicated nature of talking about gun violence, gun rights, and gun ownership. Doing so will, admittedly, make for an extra long episode. So, we're going to be doing this episode in two parts. And of course, when I say we, I mean me, at least for this episode, this part one of this episode. But again, there'll be more people starting with next episode, so just bear with me one more time. Now, while we as the church have done a poor job in making room for different opinions, especially opinions that are advocating for something new, we've also failed as the church to respond well to prophecy. And this isn't just a church thing, this is a human thing, really. When we hear a prophetic word spoken that we agree with, we think, yeah, right on, preacher, you tell him. But when we hear a prophetic word that we disagree with, we often leave. We feel targeted. It's hard to hear a convicting word of prophecy calling us to live or think differently. I mean, just think if someone has ever offered you criticism, even constructive criticism, worded well. It's hard to hear. And so, especially if it is spiritually related and is prophetic, it is hard. It's hard to hear a convicting word of prophecy calling us to live or think differently. But that doesn't make us victims. The prophet Nathan spoke prophetic words against King David, but David was still, and is for many, still upheld as the chosen king. We need to respond to prophesying, quote unquote, against us with silence. A silence for a while in which we can pray about the truth of the prophetic word we just heard, and then a silence in which we can take from the prophetic word whatever God wants us to take from it. If people only ever heard hard prophetic words and turned away from them, then the church would still advocate slavery and a whole bunch of other injustices. So I invite us to practice restraint and silence as a response to convicting words, rather than sharpening our swords and immediately and angrily trying to set people straight. Because at the end of the day, I still have my opinions and I will still share them as uh, as balanced as I'm going to try and be. And my fellow podcast hosts, when they come back, will do the same. And in general, the opinions that we believe to be the most biblical and faithful do often contradict or shift from those held by older generations. And the way I understand history, this has always been true, that the next generation has always held opinions that either contradict or shift from previous generations. This has always been the way not just humanity, but generations within the church have acted. So, all right, deep breaths, and let's continue with the subject at hand. The reason why gun rights and gun ownership laws are a matter of debate in our country is, of course, the prevalence of gun violence in our country. Would we be having this debate if there wasn't as much gun violence? I doubt it. As mentioned in the introduction, there are almost 2 mass shootings in this country per day, and a mass shooting is defined as a shooting with 4 or more persons killed or injured. So that nearly 2 a day shooting figure doesn't count those shootings where fewer than 4 persons are killed or injured, nor does it include suicides, which we'll come back to. But for now, I'll say that in 2023, about 50,000 people were killed by guns. Just over half of that number represent suicide deaths. But either number, the 27,000 or so suicide deaths by guns, or the 21,000 or so homicides by gun violence, either number is much too large. Though not every year sees an increase in gun-related deaths or mass shootings, there is a clear increasing trend of both. In 2014, there were 273 mass shootings and 336 in 2015. And it rose to 690 mass shootings in 2021 and 647 in 2022. And all the while, gun ownership has also increased dramatically. In 2011, there were 88 guns per 100 US residents. In 2023, there were 120 and a half guns per 100 residents. Now, these are facts. We'll come back to how to interpret these facts and what causes gun violence. But for now, let's talk a little bit more about why even implicitly drawing a correlation between more guns and more deaths draws ire from many people, including many Christians. And this is fascinating to me, this information that I'm about to share. It's information that I wouldn't have known if I weren't a pastor, a lot of it. Obviously, the Second Amendment is what it is, but people's reactions and understandings of it, I would not have come into contact with if I weren't a pastor who often preached peace. Now, obviously, the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, serves as the foundational argument in favor of gun rights and ownership. The Second Amendment reads, in full, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." Now, there are many people who believe in what's called originalism or other similar constitutional theories. Essentially, the idea is that if it's in the Constitution, it is right. And sometimes it goes further to say that whatever the original intention of the Founding Fathers was should remain true for all time. And so we immediately run into a number of issues. Now, first, many Christians don't want politics talked about in church. I totally agree, insofar as what we mean is that no one should in a church say, you should vote for this person or not vote for that person, or you should vote for this party or not vote for the other party. But if the reasoning that we keep politics out of the church is that we don't want any political subject to come up in church, then essentially what we're saying is that we want to keep our politics separate from our faith. And then I have to ask, why? Shouldn't we want God to speak to our whole life and not just part of it? The separation of church and state is meant to give both church and state the freedom to be what they're supposed to be. It's not supposed to mean, especially from the church side of the equation, that we limit God's sovereignty over our lives. The church needs to still be able to be the church, and that includes prophetically speaking to the state and to those who follow the church, claiming to be disciples of Christ. Right? We need to be able to prophetically speak to them and to anybody who follows the dictates of the state. And if the church is called by God to say that guns increase violence, it needs to be able to do so regardless of the presence of the Second Amendment. Then we confront the reality that many Christians believe that God gave us the Constitution. And this part is, what I was referring to earlier as fascinating. That the idea is that there's something special about this country, manifest destiny. And God has ordained us to lead the world. And so God gave us a Constitution perfect as is. Those who believe this tend to also believe that the Bible is the same way, right? It can only ever mean one thing for all time. It's perfect as is. And to believe texts of the Bible might be interpreted differently than they've been taught amounts to changing the Bible. The same argument holds true for the Constitution, apparently. It was not a document created by fallible human beings, but rather Those fallible human beings were used by God to create a perfect founding document for the country. Now, here I will admit that I have a serious theological issue. God makes plain in 1 Samuel 8 that he never intended for Israel, the chosen people, to have a state or government. So, why would God contribute to the establishment of any other state or government? There are other issues as well, historically speaking. The first being that the Constitution was not an entirely moral document. It has needed amendments from time to time because it wasn't perfect as is. And another issue is that almost every country has believed itself to be God's country. Nazi Germany thought so, and interestingly, England thought so while it was being America's oppressor. So if the Constitution is right as is, as originally passed, either because God made it so or not, then again, what do we do about amendments? The Constitution has needed to be amended a whole bunch of times. Now, the first 10 amendments, they're kind of strange to call them amendments because they were passed with the Constitution itself, that's why they're called the Bill of Rights. But it has needed amendments. In one of those amendments, prohibition was added and then repealed. So basically, to say the Second Amendment is in the Constitution and therefore you can't take away my guns, it's not a great argument. Even if it were a good argument, though, a look at the full text of the amendment raises more questions. It speaks of a well-regulated militia. Because when colonists began turning revolutionary, England tried taking away our ability to fight by shutting down militias. It's an amendment firmly rooted in historical context. Its original meaning is clear. The government shouldn't take away the weapons of those who serve in well-regulated militias so that those militias can fight the established force of a tyrant government if necessary. Well-regulated militias were a means to keep the government honest, fair, and representative, as England was not. At least it wasn't to us. But, okay, we don't have well-regulated militias anymore. We have some small militias, but they're not well-regulated by any means. Also, how is a militia supposed to keep the government honest now? When the Second Amendment was written, and for the approximately 150 years after, the weapons available to militias were about the same as those available to state forces. Today, unless we plan on selling fighter jets and rockets to the not well-regulated militias, then threatening a dishonest government with a fighting force no longer makes the same kind of sense that it once did. Now, we may want to keep the Second Amendment for its right to bear arms not being infringed language, but the truth is that it needs to be amended. I mean, that seems obvious to me, whatever your beliefs about gun rights are, because its actual meaning no longer applies. Even its most ardent supporters don't follow the amendment. So I have not met a single gun owner who, when asked why they own a gun, says that it's to protect against a tyrannical government. There are only a very, very small percentage of gun owners who actually say that. Only when politicians and lobbyists say they're taking away our guns do people begin to say that the government is a tyranny. But that's often not the reason they own a gun in the first place, even though the Second Amendment is really only saying that you can own a gun if you're in a well-regulated militia. Now, full disclosure, if you haven't figured this out, I'm a total pacifist, which means that I don't believe in owning or using weapons of any kind in any situation. I'm also a libertarian, though, in spiritual matters as well as political and other ways, which means that what I think is right, I usually don't intend to force on others. So hear me clearly. I'm not saying that it's obvious that we should repeal the Second Amendment. I do think it's obvious that we should amend it and rewrite it in a way that makes sense for today. Either way, we need to be able to have an honest conversation about what in the world it should be moving forward if we're going to keep it for the world as it is today and for what the world might look like into the future. We need to be able to have that conversation without jumping to conclusions and yelling, again, without sharpening our swords. The Constitution can be amended. It has been several times. Parts have been revealed, too, it is true. But there's no question that we need to have a conversation and write a new amendment that can actually make sense. Because if we don't, then we are essentially right now living in anarchy, which I am a Christian anarchist, which so I'm okay with it. But just be real, be honest. We are living in anarchy, even if we think we're following the law, because the law, the Second Amendment, does not speak to what's happening today at all. So rewriting the amendment, I think that's a great path to jointly together as Americans working on something that will make sense, or at least helping us to cool down the rhetoric and the fear. If we were to do so, to rewrite the amendments together, we may end up with a Second Amendment that severely limits the people who can own guns or how many guns a person can own. Or it may not. Maybe nothing would change, but at least it would make sense. Now we get back to why someone would want to own a gun in the first place. And here's where I will again say that this podcast does not necessarily represent the views of our church or nor of young adults generally necessarily. Young adults, the younger generations, not a monolith. No generation is a monolith. An older person cannot and should not go up to a 30-year-old and say, "Tell me why young adults think this." That particular young adult may not think it. And those who do can't represent all other young adults. We don't all agree. Now, yes, in general, younger generations think and live differently than older generations, and again, that has always been the case. But whatever generation you're a part of, you shouldn't look at younger generations and say that they should just do what you do because you didn't do exactly what your elders did. Generations are always, to some extent, a response to the previous generation or two. That's a general statement, but we're still human. We're still capable of individual thought. So many young adults, as mentioned in the intro, have a different school experience than older generations, and that has led to much of the differing opinion on gun rights and gun control. Research has shown that about 57% of Americans support stricter gun laws, whereas 80% of those between the ages of 14 and 30 support stricter gun laws. I think much of that has to do with the fact that on average, those same 14 to 30 year old persons know at least one person killed or injured by a firearm. Almost all of them have participated in school drills, live shooter drills. 25% of them have endured not just a drill, but an actual school lockdown. And a vast majority of 14 to 30-year-olds say they have anxiety or PTSD regarding their safety in public because of their school experiences. Younger generations have been raised with violence all around them. So no wonder we have a different idea about what the real problem is than those who didn't have the same experiences growing up. Older generations have had the experience of living through World War II, the Vietnam War, and things like that. But wars are different than gun violence possibly happening right next to you or at you. If you haven't lived through it, it's much easier to see that the US owns 3 times as many guns per capita as the next highest country and then still say guns don't kill people. But if you have lived through these more violent upbringings as young adults have, then you're likely to see that the US owns 3 times as many guns per capita as the next highest country and say guns do kill people. Now, again, not all young adults agree. In my church's group of young adults, there are a couple who believe that our gun control laws are strict enough as is, and that there are other issues that we should address to solve our mass violence problem. As we get into discussing the reasons why people want to own a gun, first of all, this is all going to come up in part 2. We are approaching the end of part 1. So we're really going to tackle this in the next part of the episode. We'll also talk about other options to addressing gun violence other than gun control. But I want to repeat at the end of this episode, the end of part 1 on gun violence and gun rights, that the reason this podcast even exists is that too often young adults have had the experience of being shut down when trying to express themselves. And this isn't just the church. You would expect the church to be better than the wider society, but it's not just the church. After the Parkland shooting in Florida, some survivors began protesting gun rights, and oftentimes certain elements of the media and those watching simply said, "What do they know? They're a kid." And I'm not making this up. It's verbatim what at least a couple of news anchors said in response to the Parkland survivors' protests. Now that behavior needs to stop. Concerning all of life's issues, not just this one. I don't care if we think that we should respect our elders more than we do, but we certainly need to respect our younger ones more than we do. But about this issue in particular, our kids and the younger generations have lived through a far more violent and unsafe period in our communities and in our schools than our parents and grandparents have. So what do the Parkland survivors know because they're just a kid? Well, actually, quite a lot. And so, if you are a young adult, what I'll say to you is what the bishop says to us clergy when we're being ordained: take thou authority. What I mean by that is trust that your voice really matters. I know it's hard because oftentimes when we speak up, the forces of tradition tell us to sit down and just follow. But your lived experience matters, your voice matters. And that's how I'm going to end this episode. And then again in part 2, the next episode, we will talk about why someone would want to own a gun in the first place and what we might do. What are all the options in terms of addressing gun violence? So join us next time for part 2. Until then, keep it holy, friends.